I would like to focus my presentation on the implementation of green policies and strategies with a particular angle on international cooperation. Indeed, the aim of today's conference is to identify where more international collaboration would improve the policies in favor of a more sustainable production. And we thought it would be useful to start by classifying the many existing initiatives that have already been taken before suggesting areas where more collaboration would help. One important reminder to start with: while we only focus today on sustainable production, we are of course fully aware that there are many other and important aspects when it comes to increasing sustainability in the audiovisual sector, including exhibition, broadcasting and streaming, and dealing with facilities, with data centers, devices and so on. But this is beyond the scope of today's discussion. Still, content matters. Let me just quote a figure from Netflix, which estimates that the physical production of content roughly accounts for 50% of its carbon footprint. So we prepared an overview of ongoing initiatives, and to do so we did a rudimentary mapping exercise, certainly not comprehensive, but trying to identify as many initiatives as possible. We already identified about 300 initiatives or measures that either already exist or are planned for the soon future. There are, of course, many ways to group these initiatives, but for this presentation, we chose to follow a logical order, from developing strategies to assessing the impact. And I will now briefly go into the details of each category of initiatives. The first step is, of course, to define sustainable production strategies. There is obviously a number of working groups already in place, be it at subnational, national, or international level. A number of individual organizations, either public bodies or industry players, have already put in place a green policy, and many are working on it. And also, several professional associations have launched pledges, meaning commitments from their members to follow a series of best practices. So, indeed, a multiplicity of initiatives, many driven at subnational level, which implies probably a difficulty for all the sector to know who is doing what, and therefore limited coordination and synergies. Defining a sustainable production strategy obviously implies to have a definition of what is sustainable production. And here, the standards, certification, and labels come in. There are several non-industry specific standards that can in principle be applied to the film and audiovisual industry. They are sometimes completed explicitly by an adaptation to the production industry. But in the context of this conference, we have focused on trying to identify specific industry standards. And what we have found are mostly about normative standards or guidelines, rather than standards adopted by national or international standards bodies. In that domain, we could only identify the British Standard 8909, which specifies requirements for a sustainability management system for film. We also found that these standards are generally process standards rather than product standards, which means it is rather the audiovisual work which is certified rather than the producing company. But there are exceptions, such as the Eco-Production Company label of the European Producer Club. Given the fact that most guidelines so far have been developed on regional level, standardization of processes and labels could be an area where more national and international coordination might be beneficial. The adaptation of public funding schemes plays, of course, a key role because they contribute de facto to set up standards, and even more importantly, because they are a strong incentive to more green production. These adaptations of the funding schemes are currently happening in many funds and in many forms, including sustainability as a requirement in the application process itself, extra points attributed to green production, the support of specific greening costs, and you can find also dedicated green funding schemes and the funding of green content. The issue here might be for productions, and in particular international co-productions that apply to and have to report to several funds with different definitions of sustainable production. But we are aware that there are already internal working groups within, for instance, EFAD, Ciné-Regio, and Eurimage, so possibly this is one of the topics on their agenda. A sustainable production strategy, once properly defined, obviously would be meaningless without the proper tools and facilities to implement it. And there are a number of initiatives. Just to name a few: best practices production guides and checklists, carbon calculators, green suppliers and facility listings, and specialized consulting services. Here one can wonder whether some synergies could not be developed, for instance, regarding the production of many production best practices guides, which could be rather adapted from existing ones. And maybe also, one could wonder what is the underlying definition of sustainability, which means a supplier, a green supplier. Green policies and strategies also need to raise awareness and build expertise. A lot of stakeholders have been active in raising awareness in the industry, for example, through conferences, workshops, or dedicated information platforms. A few have started to promote green storytelling in order to raise awareness among audiences. There are also many knowledge-building initiatives, mostly in the form of dedicated training programs, the provision of green consulting services, and information platforms. Let me just point out that training is closely linked to the question of standards. For instance, sustainability managers or consultants need to act in accordance with a clear definition of sustainable production. And finally, a last category of initiatives, which at the observatory is dear to our heart: data. Data is key to measure both the impact of green policies and, even more importantly, the sustainability of the sector. Steps have been taken to assess the impact of initiatives, but as regards measuring the sustainability of the sector itself, we are still in the front of a big construction site. We, at the observatory, believe that managing comparable data at the European level is key. After this roundup of existing initiatives, and after we have seen some of the issues that they raise from an international point of view, let's immediately state that there are already some forms of international collaboration. On the one hand, there is an ongoing process of consultation within international organizations, with at least a view to share best practices. And, on the other hand, some national-born initiatives are starting to expand at an international level. Birgit Heitzig's Green Film Shooting Project is a good example of these dynamics. Still, to conclude this presentation, the analysis of the initiatives that I have just presented make us think that there are some domains where international collaboration could go further and actually boost green policies. We have identified 4 fields, but more ideas will certainly emerge in the course of this conference. The first field relates to green policies. How to make sure that policies are clearer and better articulated. I want here to stress that many initiatives are taken at the subnational level and that, therefore, coordination involves the subnational, national, and international level. In that field, some attention needs probably to be paid at co-production. The second field is simply about knowledge sharing. Is there a need to better coordinate mapping initiatives and research projects? And what is the best way to foster the exchange of information without overwhelming? The third field deals with harmonization. Harmonization encompasses at least 3 topics: standards, carbon calculators, and training certification. And the fourth field is about data, meaning the definition of relevant indicator and the harmonization of methodology at national and international level. This is a field where we have some background at the observatory and to which, obviously, we would be happy to contribute. But so much for the theory. Thanks for your attention, and let's move now to hear what the stakeholders think.